Guyonne Leduc is professor of literature, civilization, history of ideas and mentalities in Great Britain in the 17th century and 18th centuries at the Charles de Gaulle University at Lille, Université Charles de Gaulle à Lille. She is the author of numerous works. Among the most important, let me mention Morale et religion dans les essais, dans les mélanges de Henry Fielding, published in 1990, L'éducation des Anglaises au XVIIIe siècle, la conception de Henry Fielding, in 1999, Réécriture anglaise au XVIIIe siècle de l'égalité des deux sexes de François Poulain de la Barre, du politique au polémique. This is a very, very important work published in 2010. Professor Leduc has also been the editor of the Bulletin de la Société d'études anglo-américaines des XVIIe et XVIIIe siècles. She has been president of that society, and she has held many other editorial positions, more significantly for today's conference of the Voice and Voix, Ways, de Femmes, études sur les femmes, le sexe et le genre. Professor Leduc has organized monumental conferences on the history of women and the history of gender, among other contexts, utopias. And she is currently director of the series Des idées des femmes, published by L'Harmattan. So we are eager to listen to you, Guyonne, and please join me in welcoming Guyonne Leduc.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to Professor Sissa and highly honored to have been invited to this roundtable. For references and quotations in my talk, I refer to the numbers on the handout, and I thank Charlotte Meissner quite a lot to enable me to share it with you, thanks to the box in the chat. So
I just posted the Polybox link, and there you can download all the handouts that have been transmitted.
So a sentence drawn from De l'égalité des deux sexes by Poulain de la Barre was chosen by Simone de Beauvoir as the second epigraph to her book, Le deuxième sexe, published in 1949, when his work was forgotten, as it were. I quote, number 1, tout ce qui a été écrit par les hommes sur les femmes doit être suspect, car ils sont à la fois juges et parties. To account for the reception and influence of Poulain de la Barre's new feminist ideas in Enlightenment France, England, and back to France, I'll use a chronological approach. I will first deal with the reception of his ideas in France and the translation of his first essay into English in 1677, then to turn to their short revival in France and their more lasting one in Britain, and finally focus on the return of l'égalité to France, incognito. Poulain de la Barre was a scholar who attended the Sorbonne. Around 1667, he was influenced by Descartes, whose rationalism so appealed to Poulain that he abandoned the scholastic theology taught at the time. During these years, he wrote and published 3 most important works, that is 3 books on the equality of the sexes. Later, he was ordained a priest in 1679, left Paris the next year, and was appointed a curate in Picardy, which he left in 85 for a smaller curacy, probably shortly before the repeal of the Edict of Nantes in October 1685. Then he abandoned his priestly career in 1688, perhaps when he saw state terror against Protestants. He seemed to have converted to Calvinism around 1688, left Catholic France for Protestant Geneva, where he was well received and taught French. Rationalism and the principle of free examination led him to have a new perspective on Christian dogma and write La doctrine des protestants sur la liberté de lire l'écriture sainte shortly before his death in Geneva. Rationalism and the principle of free examination also led him to publish 3 books on the equality of the sexes in quick succession, number 2 on your handout. De l'égalité des deux sexes, discours physique et moral où l'on voit l'importance de se défaire des préjugés, where the author is identified only as Sieur P. The next year, de l'éducation des dames pour la conduite de l'esprit dans les sciences et dans les mœurs, entretien, where his full name appears and in the course of which he also identifies himself as the author of the previous book. In 1675, De l'excellence des hommes contre l'égalité des sexes is a misleading title as it is an ironic defense on men's claims to superiority. In those essays, Poulain did not imitate the strategies used by writers involved in the Querelle des Femmes, whether about the matter, general arguments, defenses, repetitions, or the manner, panegyrics, catalogues of heroic women, dialogues, or parodies. In De l'éducation des dames, he writes that his commitment to women's equality originated in his engagement with Cartesian method. For Ruth Perry, number 3 on your handout, he was probably the first thinker to apply Cartesian skepticism to the question of women. The influence of Descartes was twofold. First, it led Poulain to question prejudices because they are based on tradition and on the authority of scholars. For him, they should be replaced by observation and critical examinations in order to build one's opinion, as the preface to De l'égalité puts it. Number 4. La nécessité qu'il y a de juger les choses par soi-même après les avoir bien examinées et de ne s'en point rapporter à l'opinion ni à la bonne foi des autres hommes si l'on veut éviter d'être trompé. He places natural reason over the authority of the ancients. He discusses scholars' authority, poets, orators, historians, philosophers, but not theologians, and rejects the authority of classical philosophers, the ancients, as well as that of the Bible. Therefore, his ideas were radical and subversive. To illustrate his method, Poulain takes the prejudice about women's so-called inferiority as an example, number 5. De tous les préjugés, on n'en a point remarqué de plus propre à ce dessein que celui qu'on a communément sur l'inégalité des deux sexes. Second Cartesian influence, Poulain develops Descartes' demonstration of the separation of the body and the mind, and thus the full autonomy of thought from the sexed body, an idea that Poulain encapsulates as, number 6, l'esprit n'a point de sexe. So, according to Gerald MacLean, he investigates the extent to which our notion of woman is a social construct based upon vulgar prejudice rather than historical fact, which constitutes one of the most important contributions to feminist thinking in the era before Mary Wollstonecraft. To sum up, Poulain wanted to give a philosophical justification to the equality between men and women thanks to a piece of reasoning, which led to a shift from courteous to rational feminism. In his reasoning, he included some feminist ideas already circulating at the time. For example, when he writes L'esprit n'a point de sexe, he was not the first to do so, as is proved by Marie-Frédérique Pellegrin in her new edition, number 8 on your handout. The diffusion and reception of his 3 treatises in France at the time can be estimated thanks to a review of the circulation of his books. His contemporaries had a limited interest in his work. 3 editions of De l'égalité were published in Paris in 1673, 76, and 79, number 9 on your handout. 2 counterfeit editions were published in Geneva in 1690 and 92 and reveal the name Sieur F. P. de la Barre. It was included in one single volume with his 3rd treatise, De l'excellence des hommes, because it was said that De l'égalité was intended to respond, or of course in advance, to the central part of De l'excellence. De l'éducation des dames, printed in 1674, was reissued in 79. Poulain maintained his anonymity on the title page, but signed Poulain at the bottom of a letter to Mademoiselle de Montpensier, to whom he dedicated the book. The first edition of De l'excellence des hommes was published in 75 in Paris. The same year, a counterfeit edition appeared in Lyon. For Desmond Clark, number 10 on your handout, there were no further editions, as if his revolutionary theses were too radical even to merit the objections of critics. He was proposing that women could exercise all the same offices and functions as men in civil and religious society. In contrast with his fortunes in France, Poulin's De l'égalité became a significant source text for feminist writing in English. It was translated into English, number 11, as The Woman as Good as the Man, or The Equality of Both Sexes, written originally in French and translated into English by A.L. in 1677, by an anonymous translator identified later as Archibald Lovell, using the 1676 Paris edition. It is a very faithful translation, but which had met first little response in England. Why a translation in 1677? For Maclean, number 12, the legal status of women to hold professional and political office must have seemed important when Mary, daughter of the king's brother, married the Protestant Prince William of Orange. The publisher must have considered the book capable of attracting readers. Besides, the title included, quote, written originally in French, and French ideas were fashionable then. Several translations of French texts were published that year, number 13, for instance, by Gauthier de Coste de la Calpredenne, Mademoiselle de Scudéry, or Pierre Nicole. Nevertheless, English readers in 1677 seem to have shown indifference to the translation, perhaps judged too radical, as Poulain wrote, for instance, that women could become preachers and even priests. To some degree, Poulin's ideas gained public attention in France about 20 years after their publication, number 14. The reader's interest in these feminist ideas must be attributed to the climate of polemic discourse that swept the country over the querelle des anciens et des modernes between 1688 and 1694, the arguments made by the moderns for the continuity of the human spirit in reaction to the perfection of past authority created a culture war in which women were asked to play their parts. First, Poulain, as we said, questioned prejudices and took that concerning women's so-called inferiority as an example. So he criticized tradition and authority, that of the ancients and the learned, and of the Bible. Second, the querelle des anciens et des modernes could be linked to the querelle des femmes, which was for Elizabeth Berg, number 15, not only a literary debate, but also the manifestation of a political position regarding the status of women and their right to participate in the culture of their society. The repeated realignment of feminism with modernism is inevitable, for modernism represents a rejection of the patriarchal tradition, a rejection that is necessary to feminism. Thus, number 16 on the handout, on the one hand, the timing for Poulin's 1690 edition of the restructured De l'égalité, de l'excellence, bound under one cover, corresponded to a definite evolution in the mentality of the French autocratic society. On the other hand, the absence of publication of De l'éducation at that time can be understood because of the fundamental contradiction between the moderns' reliance on innate or natural feminine good taste and Poulin's vision for feminine scholarship, that is something acquired. Yet, many of his ideas were borrowed. See, for instance, number 17, ideas borrowed by Gabrielle Suchon in her Traité de la morale et de la politique, which is presented as a defense of the female sex, or Guyonne de Vertron, for instance, referring to Poulain as an illustrious author. Other writers omitted their debts to Poulain, number 17 still, Noël, Morvan de Bellegarde, or Claude Buffier. The French edition of 1690 was exported to London by a French Huguenot, number 18, Pierre-Antoine Moteux, who had fled to England in 1685, the year of the repeal of the Edict of Nantes. If Poulin's conversion to Protestantism may have influenced the success of the diffusion of l'égalité across the Channel in 1690, it cannot justify its translation by an Anglican in 1677. Several periodicals devoted articles to his French edition, which had more influence than the 1677 translation, for instance, number 19. Some examples of those periodicals: the Gentleman's Journal, where Moteux, the editor, writes an article entitled "The Equality of Both Sexes Asserted by New Arguments," stressing the novelty of the book's arguments before summing up its main ideas, but neither the book nor the writer are identified. The next year, the same periodical referred to a French review of the book, but without mentioning the author. In another periodical, the Ladies' Journal, in 1693, Moteux, also its editor, wrote an article entitled "An Essay to Prove that Women May Apply Themselves to Liberal Arts and Sciences." It is a patchwork of borrowings from number 22, L'égalité. Motteux adds a catalogue of famous women at the end of the essay, which proves that he did not understand the novelty of Poulin's new intellectual approach. Final example, number 21, in 1692, the Complete Library mentions Poulin's name and his book of the equality of the two sexes, a physical and moral discourse, etc., etc., and the review mentions de l'excellence des hommes. The link is not surprising since we remember the 1690 edition binds together l'égalité et l'excellence. For Sturman, number 22, these publications may have stimulated interest in Poulain among English feminists. For instance, William Walsh, number 23, in a dialogue concerning women, or Eunice Drake in an essay in defense of the female sex, who borrowed both much from the translation of l'égalité. When Mary Astel wrote a serious proposal to the ladies by a lover of her sex, she might have read these translations of Poulain la Barre in the Gentleman's Journal or the Ladies' Journal. It could also be the case of John Toland in his letter to Serena, devoting chapter 1 to the origin and force of prejudice and asserting the intellectual capacities of both sexes, arguments which were similar to those found in Poulain la Barre. Likewise, the Virgin Unmasked by Mandeville followed him. Maclean shows that Poulin's ideas were alive in England in the early 18th century, and he refers to the context. First, on the socio-economic level, number 24. It is likely that the threat of war with Spain in 1739, which also threatened to withdraw young men from the labor force and marriage market, may have helped stimulate the feminist discourse of that year. In the midst of this debate, largely concerning women's freedom to enter the workplace on equal terms with men, someone obviously thought about the argument advanced by Poulain half a century before and set about orchestrating the appearance of the Sophia's pamphlet in order to represent them to English readers. Besides, if Reformation ideology stresses spiritual equality between the sexes, the long 18th century in England was the golden age of patriarchy. As Bridget Hill notes, number 25, she refers to the reinforcement, not the weakening of the authority of husband and father. Male domination was reasserted in the family as well as in the state, increasing the public-private dichotomy. Secondly, concerning the ideological background, there was a revival of the Querelle des Femmes in mid-century Britain. In response to Lord Chesterfield's article attacking women's rights, number 26, in his periodical Common Sense, the anonymous Sophia published in November 1739 a pamphlet entitled Woman Not Inferior to Man, which was to become the epitome of feminist ideas of the time. It dismissed the idea of innate female inferiority and its corollary, male superiority, as Hastel had done before and Wollstonecraft was to do later. And it harshly criticized men's so-called usurped power over women. An anonymous answer was written by a male adversary in Man Superior to Woman in December the same year, which in turn led Sophia, the same author or another one hiding under the same name, question mark, to write Woman Superior Excellence over Man in 1740. Sophia's two pamphlets were reprinted separately in 1743, as was also the case of her adversary's essay in 1744, but with a slightly different title. The respective lengths of the three pamphlets, usually called the Sophia pamphlets, increases from 63 pages to 100 to finally 138. The addresser, Sophia, does not conceal her social rank, a person of quality, in the title of her first pamphlet, and her sex and her young age in that of the second, a young lady. The title of her first essay shows its affinity with Poulain, Woman Not Inferior. The three pamphlets literally copied the English translation of L'égalité des deux sexes in many passages, but without mentioning his name or his writing. They take up again his criticism of customary prejudices regarding women. Sophia's first pamphlet, 63 pages, includes borrowings from 56 Poulinian paragraphs. In the second one, 138 pages, she borrows from 54 paragraphs. I refer you to number 27 on the handout. Therefore, she takes up nearly the whole of Poulin's Égalité in order to write her two pamphlets. But the result is rather different from the source text, as she borrows some new ideas, but not all of them, in particular, the inequality between ranks, between human beings, and not only just between men and women. Her antagonist directly borrows 3 passages from Poulain and indirectly many passages as he contradicts Sophia. Sophia's identity remains unknown. Some critics, number 28, mention Lady Mary Wortley Montagu or Lady Sophia Fermor. It is still impossible to settle the question of the identity or even the sex of the 2 writers. Another possibility is that the writers were one and the same person, since at the time it was a rhetorical game to write on both sides of the question. It would justify the speed with which the pamphlets were written, together with the variety of the borrowings without repetitions. Sophia's treatment of men is dictated by 2 elements. Her attacks are either to be found in Poulin's treatise and then developed in her pamphlets, or they are to be read without his influence in the original passage of her texts. When Poulain criticizes men, either openly or not, and admits men's wrongs towards women, Sophia enhances his attacks using 2 devices in both of her pamphlets, that is, substitution and addition, that are either lexical or syntactical reinforcement of the content. Sophia uses them separately or simultaneously. In the case of substitution, she adopts Poulin's structures and introduces changes with them. In the case of addition, she inserts pejorative terms, particularly in her first pamphlet. When she takes the initiative to criticize men, she does not seem to be influenced by Poulain. The nature of her arguments and the violence of her vocabulary are rather different from those she resorts to in the passages where she gets her inspiration from Poulain. Her verbal audacity against men seems violent, but is a superficial rashness, hiding conceptual timidity when compared to Poulin's Cartesian philosophical background and innovations. She does not take up his subversive political idea of natural right, of natural equality, and of the relativity of ranks. Her feminist ideas seem to have developed out of the commercial circumstances of the pamphlet war. So she was strongly influenced by a man to desacralize men in order to then pave the way for more equality, or at least for less inequality between the sexes. She articulates an idea hinted at by Poulain, but not fully expressed, that is the idea of a vicious circle. I quote, "Why is learning useless to us? Because we have no share in public offices. And why have we no share in public offices? Because we have no learning." Here she borrows an argument from Mary Astell's Serious Proposal, number 29. The controversy was still active in 1751 when the Sophia's pamphlets were republished under a common title, number 30, Beauty's Triumph, or The Superiority of the Fair Sex Invincibly Proved. This edition respected the material division into the 3 treatises. The same year, 31, another treatise, Female Rights Vindicated, or The Equality of the Sexes Morally and Physically Proved, was published in London, and again in 1758, closely following Poulin's arguments, even part of its title. It means that Poulin's de l'égalité was still known enough in 1751 to lead to a new translation, even a pirate one, but not enough known for the deception to be detected. At first sight, the book, 130 pages, is just a paraphrase of Sophia's first pamphlet. But a close reading proves it is a new translation of de l'égalité, based not on metaphrase and imitation, as in Sophia's first tract, but on paraphrase, that is, translation with latitude. It combines close translation, the erasure of many passages on the body, the material aspects of motherhood and death, and of all passages on religion, together with the simplification of syntax, and therefore simplification of the complexity of Poulin's reasoning. Besides, abstract developments of women and metaphysics, on the distinctions between the sexes, law, history, the origins of societies, and the organizations of states are cut off. In short, all that is new in Poulain is avoided, even if at first sight the title Female Rights Vindicated sounds radical. In fact, over translation, Au préjudice des femmes chez Poulain, becoming, to our great prejudice, intensify attacks against men and shows a bias instead of a serious argument. Moreover, adding a catalogue of famous women in the preface proves the total misunderstanding of Poulin's new ideas and enterprise. The title may have influenced Wollstonecraft for her vindication of the rights of women, just as that of Égalité des hommes et des femmes 1622 by Marie Lejarce de Gournay may have inspired Poulain for Égalité des deux sexes. Female Rights Vindicated was republished in 1780 with a new title, 32, Female Restoration by a Moral and Physical Vindication of Female Talents. The new expression female talents mirrors the structure of female rights, but very much weakens its meaning, depriving the tract of its novelty, perhaps because the term rights might be frightening readers. On the other side of the channel, and I will come to my conclusion, on the other side of the channel, feminism seems to have been relatively weak in the early years of the century, but it reasserted itself after 1720. French publications relied on Poulain, numbers 33, 34, La défense du beau sexe, L'ami des femmes, Essai sur le caractère, L'esprit des femmes, and so on and so forth. Other authors in this period were also indebted to Poulain, such as Mademoiselle Archambault, number 35, or Philippe Florent de Puisieux in the then anonymous essay La femme n'est pas inférieure à l'homme, said to have been published in London. In fact, it was a faithful translation of Sophia's first pamphlet, Woman Not Inferior to Man, itself based on Poulain, who is not mentioned. The scholar Bernard Magnier, number 36, traces 26 parallels between the two. A second edition came out in London in 51, entitled, number 37, Le Triomphe des Dames, traduit de l'anglais de Milady P., 140 pages. As in the previous edition, dissertation dans laquelle on prouve que la femme n'est pas inférieure à l'homme, the subtitle appears on the first page. In 1987, number 38, Camille Garnier showed that the translator was in fact Madeleine d'Arsan de Puisieux, that is, a woman. So there was double plagiarism. Poulain de Égalité came back incognito to France thanks to an English rewriting by Sophia, followed by a translation by d'Arsan de Puisieux. But many distortions and omitted passages, that is, with far less complex and innovative ideas. After a faithful translation into English in 1677, the English rewriting of L'Égalité in 1739 and the latter's translation into French in 1750 include some Cartesian elements developed by Poulain, but more out of chance or commercial opportunism than out of commitment with his philosophical ideas, since some features, probably deemed too abstract for readers, are forgotten. However, those essays also aim at fighting the prejudice about women's so-called inferiority. If Poulain wants to show that systematic doubt helps to fight prejudices based on traditions, in particular about women's so-called inferiority, Sophia's rewriting and its later translation have a kind of militant perspective because of their sometimes aggressive tone that cannot conceal their conceptual shyness, quite simply because they do not understand the boldness of Poulin's ideas. They lack his subversive arguments about natural right, natural equality, and the relativity of the notion of hierarchy. His ideas are innovative because he considers inequalities not only between men and women, but in a larger perspective. He criticizes all that is not based on reason, in particular men's power over women, the inequality between sexes, men's power over other men, inequality between ranks, and even that of the absolute king over his subjects. All the strength of his critical thinking is lacking in those essays. So he appears as a man who plays a historical role in women's intellectual emancipation, paving the way for equality between the sexes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guyonne. This was incredibly rich and enlightening for all of us. It really conveys the sense of how ideas circulate and rebound, how translations and textual work is ideologically important. I'm sure there are all sorts of questions at the same time. I'm agonizing a bit, I must admit to all of you, because it is 6:20. We are 5 minutes late on our agenda, so I would like to ask perhaps one question. Is there one question? And once again, we will have at the end, my communication is short and shorter than I thought, than I had planned. So we have a few minutes at the end for questions that would come to mind over time. But if there is an immediate question, one, we are happy to take it. I trust. Guyonne, oui, on prend une question. We take a question. Your English is just wonderful, fascinating for me. So, est-ce qu'il y a une question sur Poulain de la Barre, who is really a giant in the history of the debunking, we could say, or the sort of critical thinking on the thick tradition of prejudices, and he says, as he says, Benjamin, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for this paper. It's great. I enjoyed it a lot. I was just wondering, for self-interested reasons, two things. I mean, on the one hand, from his education, is there any evidence for Poulain de la Barre having studied any Roman law? On the other side of the time axis, is there any evidence for Poulain de la Barre's reception in the American colonies, of these English translations reaching across the Atlantic? Thank you.
Concerning your second question, I can't remember any reference to the reception of either the first or the second or even the third pamphlet in the American colonies, even in American scholars' books. It does not mean there were several scholars, C.A. Moore, Madeleine Alcover, in spite of her French name, she wrote in the United States. I can't remember any echo. It does not mean that there were none in the American colonies. Concerning your first question, he was very widely read. He read apart from theology, of course, which was taught at the Sorbonne at the time, when you remember that Descartes' books were forbidden by the Catholic Church, were on the index of forbidden books. He was widely read, and probably he knew, as all well-read men, perhaps women, as all well-read men of the period, he probably read, if not in Greek or in Latin, but he probably read or heard of books concerning Roman law. It was very important for Protestant people too.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question and for the answer. Once again, there might be other questions later.